This lecture video concerns Plato's Republic, Book 4. But before I begin Book 4, I want to go over a recap of some of the main themes relevant for this book and the other books I'll be presenting. By no means, of course, does it cover everything relevant in the text, but these are some of the main points I want to recap. First, Plato's Republic begins with the question, what is justice? What is the nature or the essence of justice? And we see at least two main definitions given in the first book. Justice is giving to each what is owed. This is later problematized by Socrates. And then justice is the advantage of the stronger, the definition offered by Thrasymachus that is further problematized by Socrates. Through this discussion between Socrates and Thrasymachus, Thrasymachus ends up arguing that it's more profitable to be unjust than just, which raises the question, well, why should one be just at all? So now we not only have the metaphysical question, what is justice, what is the nature of justice, but the normative question, why be just? Why should I be just? Now this leads to a distinction between justice being valuable in itself and justice being valuable for external reasons, or the consequences one obtains from being just. We see this in Book 2 as well with the story of the Ring of Gyges. And why one ought to be just, because it seems like if one has the opportunity to never be caught committing acts of injustice, that it's more profitable to be unjust. Now, the Ring of Gyges, the story is about human nature. How are we inclined to behave? Assuming that humans are not necessarily, maybe fully unjust, terrible human beings, but we are inclined to commit acts of injustice without external reasons, without punishments, right? That we fear, that we don't want to receive. That's why we act just. But can we learn to act justly for justice's own sake? And the question is, assuming that it is in our nature not to act justly for its own sake, but rather, what if through education this is possible? It is this question of education that really concerns the constructing of the city. When the city soul analogy is mentioned, to know what justice is, why one ought to be just. Well, let's look at justice in a city. It's something bigger, easier to identify, and then we can see, once we understand the characteristics of justice, how that maps onto the individual. Education is so important in the founding of the city, right? This involves all kinds of arguments against imitation and things like that. Now, when they begin constructing the city in speech, in logos, this literally ideal, in a sense, that it is not of the physical world of the present, they begin with the city of necessity that Socrates describes, right? This fully self-sufficient, small city living moderately. They end up moving on to what Socrates calls the feverish city, because Glaucon mentions all these different kinds of desires that people are interested in, that they would want to enjoy. And the city of necessity, or as he calls it, the city of pigs, doesn't offer that. So why live in that city? Why is it desirable? Now, there are all these kinds of problems, though, because as you introduce these different desires that are going to be satisfied, it ends up creating conflict, a division in the city. To purge the fever from the city, to purge this division, this conflict among the city inside itself. This moves us on to Book 4. Well, I should say it actually begins with the idea of a noble lie at the end of Book 3 with the myth of the metals. And from the idea of the noble lie, we're able to establish certain kinds of class divisions, and as we'll see, it's these class divisions that will eventually, once we understand their role fully, allow us to have a unified city that fully purges the city of its fever. Okay, so book 4 begins with Adeimantus asking Socrates the question, will the citizens of the ideal city be happy? And I want to note up front in book 4 that Socrates refers to this ideal city that they're constructing, the city where justice exists, as Kallipolis. The literal translation is the beautiful city. He only mentions it once. He only calls it once the beautiful city. But this is what this city ultimately that is being described in the Republic is called. Kallipolis, the beautiful city. So Adeimantus asks, will the citizens in Kallipolis be happy? Socrates responds, but surely you see that men who are not guardians of the laws and the city, but seem to be, utterly destroy an entire city, just as they alone are masters of the occasion to govern it well and to make it happy. And it seems like he's referring to sophists, people who, or not just the sophists, but people who just appear like they have just intentions or they are fit to rule. So they're masters of the occasion. Maybe they're very persuasive. So we can think of demagogues, maybe even populists, right? That kind of rise to power. But they're not, they appear like they're fit to rule. But maybe they're really not. But Socrates continues, saying, now, if we're making true guardians, men least likely to do harm to the city, and the one who made that speech is making some farmers and happy banqueters, like men at a public festival, and not like members of a city, that he must be speaking of something other than a city. The person who's going to, like the sophist or the demagogue or whatever, who's not really fit to rule, speaking of something other than a city, the way they talk about happiness in this city and things like that, right? Because that's the question. Well, what kind of happiness are we interested in? Continuing, so he says, so we have to consider whether we are establishing the guardians looking to have the most happiness, or else, whether looking to this happiness for the city as a whole, we must see if it comes to be in the city, and must compel and persuade these auxiliaries and guardians to do the same, so that they'll be the best possible craftsmen at their jobs, and similarly for all the others. And with the entire city growing and being fairly founded, we must let nature assign to each of the groups its share of happiness. So there's happiness for the whole of the city, but also a specific kind of happiness for each group. And we want this to come from nature itself. So we don't want to try to imagine some kind of an ideal happiness that corresponds to each group that isn't applicable. It can't apply to each group in reality. It has to come from the group itself. So specifically, when we're talking about happiness, Socrates says, in Kallipolis, we are looking for exceptional happiness for the city of the whole, ultimately, as a whole, not just any one group. So we're not going to privilege the working class, we're not going to privilege the happiness of the ruling class, but as a whole. And the way that we ensure there's happiness as a whole is we assign everyone a happiness that's suitable to them. It is in their nature for the class they perform, or the class that they are of, and then within that class, the specific roles that they might perform, the happiness corresponds to that role. Now they mention, in thinking about what this happiness consists in and how this is possible, they want to avoid extreme wealth and extreme poverty. When you have extreme wealth, for example, it hurts the health of the city. You might wonder, why would it be the case that if you have an abundance of resources, the health of the city, acting as a whole, is hurt? And one reason that, for example, we can think back to Aristotle when he talks about this in Book 2 of the Politics, but also some of the little bit of back and forth we get here at this point in the dialogue, is that you need some kind of a motivation to do your job. So you need some reasons why you work. On the other hand, though, we don't want extreme poverty. We don't want it to be the case that there's the risk of death and living in poverty if you don't work. So there is a floor as well. And we also don't want then extreme inequality. When you have extreme inequality, you're going to get groups pitted against each other. You want to avoid the Greek word stasis, or a kind of civil strife. You have to have the city working as a whole for itself, for the sake of itself. And you can only do this if every part benefits from themselves, and through working for themselves, they're also working for the sake of the city. They have to be unified in that way. Secondly, each citizen must be brought to that which naturally suits them. So, one person, one job. This is reminiscent of what was mentioned in the city of necessity. But in this case, of course, there are far more jobs than was in the city of necessity. Now, it's interesting because you want to have each person excel in their job. And the thought is that, again, and this also corresponds to one's nature, one's soul. Some people are maybe better educators as opposed to, mathematicians or athletes or warriors, doctors, whatever else it may be. So you want to tap into the nature of each, and this should correspond to the myth of the metals as well. But in the myth of the metals is meant to also justify the way that each person's duty is to perform that role that corresponds to their class. But you want each person to perform one job to excel at it. And what's interesting then is you don't have a bunch of people that do different jobs for their own benefit in a kind of like libertarian scenario where everybody is self-interested, and through the kind of like, invisible hand of the marketplace, it benefits the city as a whole. That's not the idea here at all. Plato, the Greeks are entirely opposed to that conception. You want the city to grow to be a one, not a many. But you need this to happen like parts in a machine, right? You want, for example, if I'm driving a car, a brake to perform the brake function well and not other things as well. So if everything is well oiled and running, you can trust everyone to do their own parts well to make the machine run well. And so Socrates says, and hence the regime once well started will roll on like a circle in its growth. For sound rearing and education, when they are preserved, produce good natures. And sound natures, in their turn, receiving such an education, grow up still better than those before them, for procreation as well as for the other things, as is also the case with the other animals. So you kind of get this feedback loop that allows the city to grow and sustain itself as a one, to avoid fracture, to avoid stasis. So I think there are three questions at this point that we should consider, both about reflecting on what we've read up to this point in the Republic, but also to think about as we move forward. So the first question concerns the fact that in the Republic, they agree that there should be no innovation of music or gymnastics that goes against the established order. Why? Now, they give this for reasons of the problems of imitation and how education is so important and you don't want corruption of the youth. But this is very interesting because it appears anti-Socratic if we think of Socrates as being the gadfly of Athens, criticizing, questioning, annoying the established order. Second question, if we have proper education, to what extent are laws necessary? So let me read, just to give more context to this, and why exactly they argue this. So Socrates says, but to set them down as laws is, I believe, all different kinds of laws concerning all different kinds of things about how the marketplace might operate, the care of parents, the bearing of the body, everything else like that, clothes and shoes. And he says to set all these different things down as laws, to regulate all that, I believe is foolish. Surely they don't come into being, nor would they be maintained by being set down as laws in speech and in writing. How could they? Adeimantus responds. So Socrates says, at least it's likely, Adeimantus, that the starting point of a man's education sets the course of what follows too. Or doesn't like always call forth like? Of course. Then I suppose we'd also say that the final result is some one complete and hearty thing, whether good or the opposite. Of course, he said. That, I said, is why I for one wouldn't go further and undertake to set down laws about such things. Because you'll notice there's a good deal of talk about the kinds of institutions, in terms of classes, education. There's been a lot of description about that occurs in Callipolis. But there's not a lot of discussion actually about the laws of Callipolis. So he says, and in the name of the gods, what about that market business? The contracts individuals make with one another in the market, and if you wish, contracts with manual artisans, and libel, insult, lodging of legal complaints, and the appointment of judges, and, of course, whatever imposts might have to be collected or assessed in the markets or harbors, or any market, town, or harbor regulations, or anything else of the kind. Shall we bring ourselves to set down laws for any of these things? It isn't worthwhile, Adeimantus said, to dictate to gentlemen. Most of these things that need legislation they will, no doubt, easily find for themselves. Yes, my friend, Socrates said, provided, that is, a god grants them the preservation of the laws we described before. And if not, Adeimantus said, they'll spend their lives continually setting down many such rules and correcting them, thinking they'll get hold of what's best. What's interesting about that is the limits of utopian thinking. It's not that there can't be ideal laws, but it's that those who are just, the guardians, the philosopher king ultimately, they will be the ones to know when these various circumstances arise, what kinds of laws will be appropriate for the regulation of those practices in Callipolis. But there's also a further question, which is, well, if the city is just, to what extent are laws necessary? Or maybe even laws won't be necessary if the city as a whole is just. We only feel the compulsion to set out laws and think there must be laws because we don't live in a just society. The third question. The idea is that Callipolis should act as a whole. It should be for the sake of the one, not the many. But it's interesting because as we've seen a little bit, at least, maybe with the myth of the metals, but as well, I think as we continue to see, we might want to ask, are there actually two cities inside Callipolis? The appetite of class and the guardians, mainly, at war with each other. To what extent are they actually operating in harmony as a one? Or is there a kind of class dynamic where their interests ultimately are opposed to one another? I mean, one question might be, why would Plato write that? If it is the case, it might not be the case, but if it is the case, is he doing that on purpose? Is it for a pedagogical reason, for the reader to find out, to try to understand some kind of maybe a problem of politics and society? Or maybe Plato overlooked this fact. Maybe he should be criticized for this. So, one last question concerning these three questions as a whole. Does our understanding of these three questions change since we are speaking of perfect justice and not an unjust society? Perhaps these are questions, like maybe it's anti-Socratic, the first question about that there is no innovation in music or gymnastics that goes against the established order, because perhaps Socrates only acts the way he does because he's living in an unjust society. Maybe there would be no need for Socrates in the just society. But also, if Socrates is a philosopher, would that mean there'd be no need for a philosopher? These are very difficult questions that have been asked for basically as long as, the Republic has existed. Now, at this point, they say, I suppose our city, if that is, it has been correctly founded, is perfectly good. This might give us pause as well to ask, well, has it been correctly founded or based upon what intuitions have been informative and so on? But at this point, they determine the city is founded. And they realize there are three virtues that they can identify in Callipolis: wisdom, courage, and moderation. And each of these virtues corresponds to each of the classes. Now, the city has good counsel, insofar as we think of the guardians and the role that the guardians perform. The guardians provide the city with good counsel because they possess knowledge. And Socrates says, is there in the city we just founded a kind of knowledge belonging to some of the citizens that counsels not about the affairs connected with some particular thing in the city, but about how the city as a whole would best deal with itself and the other cities? And this would be the guardian's skill, the kind of knowledge possessed by the guardian, the knowledge of ruling. Now, this is a different kind of knowledge that's possessed by the auxiliary class, the warriors. Their virtue is not wisdom. It's not to see the connections among things and how to settle disputes and how to ensure things flourish. It is courage. It is a spiritedness for the defense of the city for the sake of the city. The city preserves the opinion produced by law through education about what is terrible. And Socrates says, this kind of power and preservation through everything of the right and lawful opinion about what it is terrible and what not, I call political courage. Remember, right, the auxiliaries are to be educated to be like dogs. And what are dogs if not absolutely loyal to their owners? Lastly, moderation. The desires in the common many are mastered by the desires and the prudence and the more decent few. He says moderation is surely a certain kind of order and mastery of certain kinds of pleasures and desires. And so the working class exemplify moderation. So for Sune, because they focus solely on their tasks, on what they are good at, and they don't overdo it with other kinds of concerns, but enable a kind of balance among the various classes. So again, the virtue of the ruling class of the guardians is wisdom. The virtue of the auxiliaries, the warrior class, is courage. And the virtue of the working class is moderation. It is at this point that Socrates says, "It appears, you blessed man, that it's been rolling around at our feet from the beginning, and we couldn't see it after all, but we're quite ridiculous. In my opinion, we have been saying and hearing it all along without learning from ourselves that we were in a way of saying it. Of justice, the virtue of justice, and what its definition is." And he says, justice is the minding of one's own business and not being a busybody. Justice is the minding of one's own business and not being a busybody. At first, this might sound a little strange. Why would justice, concern not being a busybody? I mean, again, we might think again of Socrates being the kind of gadfly of Athens. It seems that then, does this mean Socrates is unjust? But again, let's think of this in ideal terms, in the utopia, where maybe Socrates isn't necessary. Although, again, that still raises the question, well, if justice is a regulative ideal, that kind of thing that we aspire to exemplify, even if we can't do it perfectly, then couldn't we still identify Socrates as being unjust even in an unjust world? I'll put that question aside. Two things to clarify this definition of justice. What it means in the minding of one's own business is doing the thing that is most suitable to you or the thing that belongs to your nature. So it doesn't mean literally not being concerned with other affairs, but it means trying to master and focus on that thing that is most suitable to you and to flourish in it. But secondly, justice, right? How do we think about, we have the virtues of wisdom, courage, and moderation. Where does justice fit in the city? Because it's not like one of the classes represents justice. So justice as the minding of one's own business and not being a busybody, because everybody performs their tasks to make the city a one and not a many. Justice is that which allows the other virtues to come into being. Because everybody performs their different tasks of, focusing on ruling and being wise, focusing on defending the city with courage, and focusing on producing all the necessities with moderation, the city is able to operate in harmony. So justice enables the other virtues to come into being. It's the conditions for the flourishing of the other virtues. One last thing about this definition of justice. I think we can see the dialectic occurring here, because if you remember that earlier definition by Polemarchus of justice as what is, giving what is owed to someone, the having and giving of what is owed. Well, we can see again this clarification Socrates gives of justice. The having and doing of one's own and what belongs to oneself would be agreed to be justice. So think of the dialectic in terms of, we find the problems with the idea that justice is, the giving to what is owed, someone is owed. We see the problem with that. But we don't just abandon that notion. Some part of it continues along in our discussion and is incorporated into a higher, more complete form of the concept of justice. So we can literally in this moment see the dialectic at play in the dialogue of the Republic. But once again, that's going to make me ask, well, to what extent is this truly the definition of justice in itself as it truly is? And to what extent then is this definition of justice informed by the preconceived notions of the interlocutors? To what extent is this definition of justice framed by certain parameters, by the interests of the group, by the desires they might have in thinking about what justice is, what its purpose might be? To what extent then might this definition of justice be a noble lie? And again, to be a noble lie doesn't mean it's literally wrong. A noble lie is that which enables one to move forward to that ideal, to be, virtuous, to be just. So it's not that even if this definition of justice is a noble lie, it's not that it's wrong, but that it's not the full story of justice, so to speak. It's relevant for the speakers, for the interlocutors. Now that might be wrong though. This might be the definition of justice in itself, as it truly is. It might not be a noble lie. But if it is a noble lie, that also might be the function it might be performing. A further consideration about this definition of justice, and if it is a noble lie, is this test that Socrates puts forward to themselves, those members in the dialogue. All right. So Socrates, after they've discussed what the definition of justice is, how they understand it, he says with Glaucon, "Let's not assert it so positively yet, I said, but if this form is applied to human beings singly and also agreed by us to be justice there, then we'll concede it. What else will there be for us to say? And if not, then we'll consider something else. Now let's complete the consideration by means of which we thought that, if we should attempt to see justice first in some bigger thing that possessed it, we would more easily catch sight of what it's like in one man," so referencing the city-soul analogy. "And it was our opinion that this bigger thing is a city. So we founded one as best we could, knowing full well that justice would be in a good one at least, a good city. Let's apply what came to light there to a single man, and if the two are in agreement, everything is fine. But if something different should turn up in the single man, we'll go back again to the city and test it. Perhaps considering them side by side and rubbing them together like sticks, we would make justice burst into flame, and once it's come to light, confirm it for ourselves." So they have to see, does the city-soul analogy hold up? It's not just a question for the interlocutors, Glaucon, Adeimantus, and so on, but for the reader as well. So, we have in the three classes of the city, the guardians, auxiliaries, and workers. And the virtues that correspond to each of the classes, wisdom, courage, and moderation. Well, they compare to the individual, and they find in the individual three classes of the soul: the rational part, the desiring part, and the appetitive part. The rational part, what is its virtue? Wisdom. The desiring part, courage. And the appetitive part, moderation. So they say this, if this is the ideal city, if this is its three classes that correspond to the three virtues of the city: wisdom, courage, and moderation, and justice is the enabling of these three virtues to flourish, then we'll find in the individual, comparing them side by side, wisdom, courage, and moderation. That makes the just individual. But there's something to consider. So I'll read here from 443c. And this, Glaucon, Socrates is saying, turns out to be, after all, a kind of phantom of justice. That's also why it's helpful. The fact that the shoemaker by nature rightly practices shoemaking and does nothing else, and the carpenter practices carpentry, and so on for the rest. So so justice as minding one's own business and not being a busybody. It looks like it, Glaucon says. But Socrates says, in truth, justice was, as it seems, something of this sort. However, not with respect to a man's minding his external business, but with respect to what is within, with respect to what truly concerns him and his own. He doesn't let each part in him mind other people's business, or the three classes in the soul meddle with each other, but really sets his own house in good order and rules himself. So they're talking about, look, we were thinking about this idea of not being a busybody in terms of each person in the task they perform not being concerned with other tasks. But that's not actually the truth of what justice is. It works for talking about how we structure the city. But it doesn't quite match up with the soul. Because when we're talking about the soul, the idea is it's an internal kind of prudential structure, prudential ordering. And you have in the tripartite soul, right? Reason governs itself, but reason also ensures, right, through the use of reason, why the desiring part of the soul and the appetitive part of the soul should be concerned with their own affairs. So the desiring part shouldn't be concerned with the appetitive part, and it shouldn't be concerned with reason. Likewise, the appetitive part shouldn't be concerned with the reason or desiring part. It's the rational part that governs the three, and when each then perform their function excellently, then we have the just individual. So it's a kind of internal ordering. He arranges himself, Socrates says, becomes his own friend, and harmonizes the three parts exactly like three notes in a harmonic scale: lowest, highest, and middle. And if there are some other parts in between, he binds them together and becomes entirely one from many, moderate and harmonized. Then and only then, he acts, if he does act in some way, either concerning the acquisition of money, or the care of the body, or something political, or concerning private contracts. In all these actions, he believes and names a just and fine action, one that preserves and helps to produce this condition, and wisdom the knowledge that supervises this action. While he believes and names an unjust action, one that undoes this condition, and lack of learning, in its turn, the opinion that supervises this action. So again, thinking back to that question, are the interests the same? Is it in the interest of the lower class, the workers, to defer, right, in ruling to the guardians? But also, is the external minding of one's own business, does that actually correspond to what Socrates is talking about internally with the ordering of the soul that makes a just person? So going back to having to compare them side by side, does the city-soul analogy still hold up? So I actually want to end this video lecture by asking, is this account of justice plausible? How do you think about it?